So you all saw me earlier, and now I'm actually going to give my actual talk now. All right, so I'm excited to be back here. I was here 2 years ago talking about transitioning from Enzyme over to React testing library. And now I'm here talking about Next.js this time. Because when React first came out, it had this really cool feature in that it wasn't attached directly to the DOM. You had your own UI building, and then it resulted or flushed to the DOM. And it also included another thing, which was to be able to render to a string. So Next.js took that capability in order to build its initial server-side rendering. It's isomorphic framework where you can use the same code to render on the client as you do on the server. So actually, how many people here developing Next.js have been using it? Okay, about half. Awesome, awesome. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna run through a demo app that I have built and look through all the different ways that you can render with it. So I'm gonna go here and build it, and it's gonna be building JavaScript, building CSS, as well as building some static assets, which I'll be talking about later. But in the meantime, let me get you all to stand up. So I know Kent already made you do it this morning. We're gonna do it again. I've already seen some yawns, right? And your stomach is digesting your food, so the blood is leaving your brain. So I want to make sure that you can pay attention. Here we go. So we're gonna do 10 squats again, just like that. You guys got it? Oh, we're gonna do it all together. Okay. So some people were too excited. All right. So here, let's do it. Ready? And since this is React, it's JavaScript. Let's do it zero-based, okay? So we're gonna start at 0. Here we go. And we're gonna go to 9, remember that. Okay, here we go, ready? 0, that was weird. 1, 2, great squats. 3, 4, that's halfway, yeah. 5, 6, we're almost there. 7, 8, 9, and oh, I got some of you. I got some of you. Ha ha. Yes, off by 1 error. Look at that. All right, thank you so much for that. So let me formally introduce myself. My name is Ben Ilegbodu. I'm a Christian, a husband, and a father. Here's my family. That's my wife, Rashida. We've been married a little over 13 years or so. And our oldest daughter, Simone, she turned 10, so we were at a Disney cruise to celebrate her 10th birthday. Highly recommended, by the way. Our middle daughter, Avery, she is 7, and our son, Asher, there, he's 5, and we live right outside of Houston, Texas, there, okay? And Asher is wearing a Rockets shirt because we're huge Rockets fans, basketball fans, I am. I would really love to go to the Miami Heat game today, but I have to leave early in the morning, and I'm not quite sure if you all will win today. But anyway, let's keep going. I am, like he mentioned, a software engineer at Netflix. I work on the TV UI that you all love to use, I'm sure. So if you have, that was totally on me, all right? And I'm also a Google developer expert here. But you didn't come to hear more about me. You came to learn more about rendering in Next.js here. So let us go back to our app. So it has built all of the things. It's built some static pages as well, which will make sense. So let's go ahead and start this demo app and start looking into how it works. So here it is right here. It's a simple blog page. Basically, it's one of the starter templates from Next, actually. And I repurposed it for this demonstration here. And there was the home page, and then there's just a bunch of blog posts here. All right, so let's start with the first type of rendering, which is client-side rendering, also known as CSR. And in this case, the page HTML is generated on the browser for every request. So we're getting new HTML every time the browser executes here. So let me go down to client-side rendering here. And you can see there, let me reload it again, that it took a while for the page to load, right? So we're getting all of the data. We get back an initial HTML page, which I'll show right here. We have this initial page here in the bottom right. Let's skip through all of those font tags there. And our initial HTML is just this P tag that says loading. That's the only thing that's sent off, and then everything renders on the client there. So one nice part about it, I guess, is that the server response time is really fast because all it is just an HTML file with the name word loading. So here, it took 8 milliseconds, which is actually really fast to have a response there. But as we saw, it took a while for the page to actually load. And there was no caching going on here because it's unique to every render. So if I refresh the page, again, it's loading for some amount of time, and then there's this loading recommendations, and those stories can load in. So every render is unique, as I was saying. So if, let's say, this isn't backed by CMS because I didn't want to spend that much time working on it, but the blog posts are on the file system. So let's say I go in and make a change there to it, and if I refresh and everything works appropriately, we'll see that the name of the title of it changed, which right now doesn't seem all that magical, but it'll make sense in a little bit. Okay, so that is client-side rendering. If you are familiar with Create React App, we were talking about that earlier. Basically, all of the initial versions of how you built a React app worked client-side. You shipped an empty HTML page, and bam, everything happened on the client. So you can use Next.js to build a client-side rendered app. It's typically not the way that you would do it, but it's possible. And as a result, the benefits of doing that are that each render is unique, has dynamic content if you needed it to be based on the query parameters or cookies or anything along those lines there. I mentioned the fast server response there, but it has poor SEO, right? Because the HTML has basically nothing in there. And in addition to SEO being poor, there's also SMO being poor, and that's social media optimization, where if you share something on Twitter or you share something in Slack, you get that rich content like images and those kind of things, descriptions. You would miss all of that because your HTML is blank there. So we could use this for the blog posts, but I would suggest that it wouldn't be the best experience, especially because SEO is important. But for things like a highly interactive user experience, like let's say Figma, you're building everything in the browser, designing everything in the browser, you don't really care about SEO, it's very user specific. Perfect example for that. Okay, so that was CSR. Let's talk about SSR, or server-side rendering, which is how we built websites from the very beginning. Everything is rendered on the server, and then HTML comes back. So, and it's for every request, again, the server is generating the HTML. So let's see how that could work. Server-side rendering here. So what you didn't even realize, potentially, is that since the server is doing the rendering, it actually takes some time for the server to respond because it has to retrieve whatever data it needs to, then it has to generate the HTML, and then it has to return, right? So I run this again multiple times. We can see here that it took a while. It took over 3 seconds for it to respond, which means that the user doesn't see anything for 3 seconds, which is not ideal. However, if I go in and we look at the HTML here at the bottom, we can see that it has all of the content for the page here. So that's great for SEO because the content is in there, right? It's rendered on the server. And we can look at the headers and see that there's nothing cached. It's set explicitly to never cache on my machine so that every time I go to the URL, it's going to request the HTML from the server there. But one thing that's interesting, though, is that even though it is server rendered, right, the recommendations are pulled in still on the client. So you can have a hybrid page, potentially, that renders the initial stuff that's important on the server, but then does the rest of it on the client that could be deferred there. So again, now, let's say this thing is CMS backed, or somehow the content of the blog post is changing. Let's put it as question marks this time. Server-side rendering works out well because we're getting the data each time we're making a request. So now we got the question marks there. So again, maybe, makes sense. Why wouldn't it change? But we'll see an example of why that makes sense when we go to the next one. So the advantages of server-side rendering, right? So the content, again, can be driven by the user information or the query parameters or what have you there. And also, it renders really fast in the browser because the HTML is already in the document. But the result of that is that the server response is really slow because it was rendered on the server. But then the positive of that is that it's SEO friendly because all the HTML is there. So you get this kind of back and forth benefit, disadvantage based upon the same thing happening. So again, I probably wouldn't server-side render the blog post. There's nothing really unique in the blog post itself that I would want to make to the individual user. But good candidates for server-side rendering are things that are highly user-specific and that you would want to render on the server. So you can think of like checkout page or search results, those sorts of things are really good candidates for server rendering. And if you want to know how to do server rendering in Next.js, just look at the docs on get server-side props. You determine what information you need, and then it'll render out the page from there. Okay, so then we have static site generation. I'll let you all catch your breaths, and I'll take a break real quick. Okay, so static site generation, also known as SSG, is where now things change a little bit. So static site generation existed back in the times of Jekyll, if anybody ever used that to do a static site build, what have you, but it became really popular in React with Gatsby, where you would build your whole entire site, it would be statically rendered, so it would be super fast. Because the HTML isn't generated on the fly at request time, it's actually built way in the beginning at build time. So if you remember, right, we built the HTML during this time at build time. There was stuff that was happening. So let's go into the app now and look at static site generation. So bam, it loaded up really, really fast. Let me refresh that again. It was so fast you couldn't even tell, right? So it responded in 7 milliseconds there, which is super fast to have an entire page come back. So it was fast like client-side rendering, but in this case, the whole HTML is actually here in the server response. So what's happening is that the next server is still running, the web server is running, but it's going to the file system, getting the HTML file that's on the file system, and just passing that back quickly. And then on top of that, what happens is that it provides a cache control header, which basically is forever. It's like 10 years or something like that. You won't even have your computer for 10 years. So it's definitely forever, right? So it is pulling from its file system cache. It's telling your computer to cache it. And then if you have a CDN in front of your website, then that will cache it as well. And that's now cached for everybody. So the advantage of static site generation is that everybody is getting the exact same HTML, so that it can be really, really fast. You don't have to worry about it being different for every user and things like that. But the one problem, actually, you can already see it. Remember, we changed this blog post to have the question marks there, but it hasn't shown up yet. And this will become apparent in that at the bottom of every blog post, I list the time in which the HTML was rendered. And if we see here, it is at 1:37, that's when it was, and it's now 1:51. So it was 14 minutes ago that this was generated when I ran that build step. So it hasn't changed since then. So if I go in and try to make a change, let's change it from question marks to ellipses, let's say, and then go and change it. It's still the old way. But the recommendation's still loaded on the client. So at least we still have that, but this content hasn't changed there. So why would you want to use static site generation? I've already explained a little bit of it, but really it's huge for SEO and performance. So because the HTML is in the page, again, that's great for SEO and SMO, and it's also highly cacheable. So if you have a page that's going to be the same for everybody in the world, right, then you can cache it for everybody in the world, and it's super, super fast there. But the disadvantage and the challenge with statically generated pages is that it's common for everybody. So if you need it to be different for people for various reasons, then it's really difficult, i.e. like not possible, because it's the same version for everyone. And depending on how many pages you have to generate, it could result in slow build times. So say it takes, let's say, half a second, quarter of a second to generate a page, but you have 1,000 of them, 1,000 blog posts because you're really prolific, or 1,000 product pages, for instance, it's going to take some time every time you're building the app there. So there were workarounds on how to deal with the unique or updating code. For instance, let's say somebody made a change in the CMS. There would be a webhook that would happen, let's say in GitHub, and it would know that change was made. Then it would create a new build, run the build again, put that in a PR. If the PR passed, then it could automatically merge that PR, and that's how you would get the sense of the code changing. So there's a lot of things that have to happen in that situation, which makes things really difficult, but it was kind of possible. But good candidates for these are actually blog posts. So my whole website, benmvp.com, shameless plug, is statically generated. So it's the content's never going to change unless I change some code and rebuild it. So static is great for blog posts. It's also great for marketing landing pages, splash pages, your acquisition pages, those sorts of things that really aren't changing that frequently as well there. So if you want to know how to use statically generated pages, those two functions in your page component, get static paths, get static props, will help with that. And I also included the fallback property here because that'll dictate what happens when someone goes to a page that may or may not exist. So I've got a link there. When you get the slides, you'll totally be able to understand and know how to implement it. Okay, so let's see. We talked about client-side rendering, CSR. We talked about server-side rendering, SSR. Just talked about static site generation, SSG. Now we've got a fourth version of rendering, incremental static regeneration. Very fancy words that I know individually, but putting them together was quite interesting. Also known as ISR, okay? So what happens in this case is it's very similar to static site generation. The difference is that the HTML can get regenerated by the server after a timeout happens. So let's check that one out. There. So we hit the page, I'll load it again, and it loaded super fast again, just like static site generation. So here, returned in 6 milliseconds, even faster. And just to prove to you, I'll scroll down and we'll see in the HTML that all of the content is there again, right? So that was there. So then what exactly is the difference? Well, what happens is in this cache control header. So now instead of the max age being 10 years, i.e. forever, it's 15 seconds. And that's something that I set, but it's 15 seconds. So what that means is that the next time someone hits requests the page, if it's after 15 seconds, then the server will regenerate a new page there. So we'll see that in action. But just before that, here is the time in which it was generated there. So let's hit the page again. It was super fast again. We can look at the headers, and it's the same 15 milliseconds. But one thing to note is this stale right here. And that's Next telling us that it now knows in the background that it has to regenerate a new page there. So if I go here, let's just make it commas, I guess. Commas. And if I reload the page here, okay, I've now changed it to be commas. So I have to wait the 15 seconds. Let's pretend in the CMS we're making changes. I keep talking so that 15 seconds will pass, right? And then I load the page there. Now the commas show up, right? So it's an opportunity. It's still not user specific, but it's an opportunity for us to update our content on a cadence. So maybe it's 15 seconds like it's here, or maybe it's 5 minutes or 3 hours or a day. It kind of depends on how often your data is going to change and how often you want it to hit your server. Because the shorter the timeout, the faster it'll reflect the change, but it's the more often that your server is going to have to do the re-rendering. Because that's the advantage of static site generation, is that your server never has to run and make that data request again. So let's talk through the advantages again and disadvantages. So just like static site generation, it's SEO friendly. All the HTML is there. You still get the fast load times because it's been pre-rendered at build time. But then we get this extra thing, which is it allows for frequent updates because you set the timeout. And you set that timeout with this revalidate property inside of get static props. Basically, you add one additional property and then you get the automatic cache timeout there. But you saw when we requested it and the timeout passed, we got that stale response. So that first person who hits it after the timeout is going to get the stale cache, and then everybody else gets the new stuff. Well, there's another fallback value called blocking that'll change that to work more like server-side rendering. So check that out as well. But it has the same drawbacks as static site generation. So great candidates for this are anything that's driven by a headless CMS, basically, because that's not going to change every time. It's going to change on some cadence, and then you can have it update that way. Okay, so those are the 4 of them, right? So you can have your site. It's not like how Gatsby used to be, where it had to be all static, or when we're doing a PHP app and it has to be all server-side rendered. Right, we have this opportunity to have any given page can be rendered any different way. So it's based upon what the page needs to do and not how the architecture is, which is really nice there. So I have some examples of what kind of pages you would want to use different strategies, in my opinion. But of course, depends on what the page is going to do, where it's getting its data there. But there's one more thing, actually. So all before this, I was talking about what's called the pages router, which is what Next had always been using. But as of Next 13, I don't know, maybe 18 months ago, they introduced the app router, which is a different way to build out pages. And it's more optimized, and it makes it technically easier to build more sophisticated things there. So I could go in and show the app router page, but it's going to look very similar to ISR based upon what this the blog posts do. But the main difference is that it allows us to do layouts and to do error handling and to do loading a lot easier. So all of these user experience things that we would have, it would be more complicated to build. It really helps with that there. So it kind of is more of a developer experience type thing versus a rendering type thing. But it does include streaming and things like that. So there's some optimizations that happen there. But the disadvantage is that the components are more complex. I can't remember who earlier today was talking about that with Next and React, but now you have to declare things as client components versus server components. And as a result of the streaming, now your web server has to be more complex and things like that. And it's a higher learning curve, to be honest, going to non-Next to Next. But there's a lot of benefits there. Cool. So here, I have a bunch of resources here. The first one is the GitHub repo that shows all of this code. I wanted to focus more on the experiences than the actual line-by-line code, but you can totally look at the examples there. I tried to leave helpful comments, and then links to all of the different documentations for all of the different features there. So yeah, I just wanted to be able to show everything here. Hopefully, if you've done Next before, you have seen something new. If you hadn't used Next before, hopefully this will be a nice pitch for you to use Next.js here. And thank you again for being here. I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you very much.